What's up, everybody? Session here. Welcome to Final Fantasy XIV. This is kind of a controller guide, if you will, of like a POV of what it's like to play this game. You can obviously choose between playing mouse and keyboard versus controller. I'm on the controller side of things. So this is kind of like a guide on how to build a hotbar. Do bear in mind, I do play with a double tap controller hotbar. So essentially, I have my skills down here, but then I also double tap to be able to kind of get to the second set of them. And you can also configure this as well easily by just going to character configuration. You go to cross. You'll want to make sure that you have settings that allow you to display the action buttons accordingly. And then you want to be able to always display them. And then in custom, you come here to enable this to double tap, and then you can do directional and actions. If you do actions, it takes rid of the directions, so don't do that. But I play with both, and then you can set them up as you want to for your hotbar. Okay, so with that in mind, with Reaper in particular, I really thrive on making sure that buttons that I'll be pressing on a constant basis are on like my face button. So like for me, I play on PlayStation, so I have cross, circle, square, and triangle. So that's where my 1, 2, 3 combo is, and Shadow of Death. Which Reaper, of course, it's important because that's basically the buff that you keep up with Reaper as often as you possibly can. You never want that timer to go away, so it's a very important button that you press quite frequently, so it's important to keep in mind. So other buttons such as Soul Slice, which you activate every 30 seconds once in a while, right? Your buff. I usually kind of keep this generalized for all my classes, so every character, job wise at least, right? The buff is somewhere on the bottom of the hotbar. I usually have the 1, 2, 3 combo going from holding the right trigger with circle into triangle into square, and then usually the X button or cross button is something that's like different. So at least with Reaper's sake, you always want to essentially make sure that before you do any other real type of attacks, you want to use Shadow of Death. So I always start off with that pretty much, and this allows you to really get your stuff going on for that. So, most of the time when you're doing raids or dungeons or trials or any kind of content, you want to be able to make sure that you're able to maintain free movement the entire time while also being able to do damage. And so that's where the 1, 2, 3 combo comes into place, because, you don't want to put it on a D-pad position, right, while you're moving, because then you kind of have to like finagle your thumbs a bit, and that does get a little bit complicated. So I usually put my combos on the same places. And so with Reaper, of course, in particular, right, they kind of rely on their Enshroud gauge and their Soul gauge. So when it comes to using like Shadow of Death, right, you put that up, and then you'll use like Bloodstock and Gallows. This is still on my face buttons so that I can have just free movement, and it makes it really easy for me to like kind of navigate and kind of prepare, because you'll still use those buttons pretty frequently. Buffs like the Arcane Circle, it's pretty unique actually for it to be on my D-pad. Usually I would try to put it somewhere on like a face button, but because I feel like Reaper has so many buttons to press, you kind of have to keep up your damage as much as you can. So putting it on a D-pad, for a 2-minute buff as well, it's not too bad to put it up there, since like most of the time, especially like in an opener scenario, usually if the boss is kind of at a certain distance, you'll charge Harpe, right, and then you'll go in to Shadow, and then right after you hit Shadow the first time through, you'll activate Arcane Circle. So usually most times when you're activating Arcane Circle, you're not moving, which is actually very nice. At least it's lined up that way for the most part for a lot of the raids we've got going on, so it comes really well in handy to pretty much put it somewhere where it doesn't kind of get in the way of you putting up the buff when you need it to the most. So whenever you're opening up and against like a boss or a dungeon or a trial, whatever the scenario is, you'll just activate Soul, which I also have on like a face button on the D-pad side of things, because as much as this button is very powerful, you don't really use it unless you use it for like optimization, or as like a getaway option or like a return. So if the boss is doing a circle mechanic, you have to run away, it's good to do harvest and then you go back in. You could open with it, but I don't usually see Reapers do that, so I don't recommend it either, since I also don't do it. But for an opener scenario, it's always good to start with Harpe, and then as you go in, you activate Shadow, and then immediately activate Arcane. So because you only use it once every 2 minutes, you don't really need to put it somewhere like here, for example. This doesn't really, well, for me personally, it doesn't really come into play, because when you're doing Arcane Circle and whatnot, right, you're gonna want to pretty much like build your Plentiful Harvest, and then you'll activate your Enshroud, and that's kind of like the gimmick behind Reaper, right, is that we want to build that blue gauge to 50, and then when we get to go nuts, and it's great. So that's pretty much like the gimmick behind Reaper. So, being able to maintain your uptime with damage and using your abilities and your skills and your cooldowns, using your combo allows you to do that. You can kind of mix stuff in there too. It does get a little bit tricky though when you need to use like your soul slice, since this builds 50 gauge for you. So, but again, I feel like in most scenarios, if you can preemptively like set yourself up to use these moves, without necessarily creating much movement, then you'll pretty much be golden, even though it feels a little weird to have it on like a D-pad button, for example. Also, in fairness too, like Reaper does have quite a lot of buttons that require like some mobility, so you'll definitely want to kind of figure out what works best for you in terms of comfort, since again you'll be spending a lot of time moving around while also doing damage. And that just goes for any future scenarios as well, because whether you're doing like a trial or a dungeon, you want to be able to figure out how to maximize that uptime. And same thing for like combos with AoE style too. Reaper's combo attacks are all circles when it comes to the basic combo for the AoE system, but it does differentiate with it's called Grimswath, because this is actually a cone. So despite Soul Scythe being a circle, Grimswath is actually a cone, and so is Guillotine. So you actually want to make sure that you party up everybody in the same general vicinity, so you can actually use that move and combo together. But again, it's good to actually have this on like a faceplate button versus like a D-pad button. That way you can continue moving while you do your attacks. So it's always really helpful to have that pretty much close by. And I also have like a really fun pattern of trying to keep moves consistently in the same place. So for example, if I hold like left trigger and press right on the D-pad, I can use Soul Slice, right? But if I double tap right trigger and press right on the D-pad, right, it's like mentally it's like right on the D-pad is my soul attack. But this is left is like telling me single target, right's telling me AoE. So I feel like if you kind of differentiate those, then it actually makes it pretty easy to use what you need to in the moment. Because when you're raiding or when you're doing any kind of content, you want to make sure that you always have like your important buttons on hand, since most of the time when you're raiding or trialing or fighting a boss of some sort, you're fighting one target, right? It's not too frequent you fight a multitude of targets. So it's really important just to make sure that all those buttons that are important are in the same place. And same thing for like moves like in Shroud. Even though in Shroud is technically on a D-pad on my hotbar, the activation rate of it is actually pretty infrequent, so that you don't necessarily have to put it on like a faceplate button. So it's really easy for me to just kind of activate it as so, right? And of course, because Give It and Gallows turn into Cross and Void Reaping, it's great that they actually just kind of stay in the same place. If I had to put these moves in different places, it'd be a lot trickier. But because they're here, I can still maintain max mobility pretty much while I do my combo, and it's right for the taking. You can just kind of do what you need to do. And then of course like Communio, you can put that with that combo too, because when I'm in Shroud mode, pretty much all four of these buttons are used for the combo. I don't have to necessarily switch around and go to different places, which I've seen pretty often. And of course, like whatever it is to your comfort, but for me at least personally, I enjoy putting them all in the same positioning and placement, because once you understand that you're doing something in a certain combo, then you don't have to stare at your hotbar and make sure you're pressing the buttons correctly. You can just remember, like, I press, square, then circle, and then square, then triangle, and then square, then triangle, and then you kind of turn your brain off a little bit while you're in the middle of doing combos. And so that usually is like what it boils down to. So I would have liked to try to figure out how to combine like Whirl of Death on the top side of the hotbar. It just wasn't happening. So this might be a little bit confusing because, Whirl of Death and Shadow of Death are not necessarily in matching positions. So if you want to, if you really, think about it, you can actually do something like, you can put them sort of like this, because I feel like both of these are on the X key or X, cross button of my controller. So at least they're in the same place. That worked out really well. But because again, like I have it in such a unique position just because, Whirl of Death is so infrequently used. But I also don't want to accidentally press another button that would be more hurtful to my damage, right? So if I, for example, put Whirl instead of like Soul Slice Scythe here, or even did it like this, these two buttons are weirdly in the same kind of formation, right? Just the trigger is different, so it would behoove me to like press this move fighting one target, and then I waste like the DPS that comes from that, you know. So I have it designed in a way where you can kind of avoid making, because you know, Whirl of Death is not as hurtful as using like your Soul Scythe versus Soul Slice. It's actually really good to kind of make sure that you don't cause like an error separating the two, for example. And like same thing with Gluttony as well. Like Gluttony is, it could be in a good position, such as like here. I see this also because again, like while you're in the middle of doing things, he's like Gluttony is an instant GCD or off cooldown GCD, for example. You can use it greatly with you know, your facial buttons instead of the D-pad, and then you can you know, keep maintaining mobility. Because with Communia, right, Communia doesn't even have like an instance, right? It's a cast attack, so it kind of functions like Heartbreak in a sense, right? So since you can't move anyways while you're using it, you might as well just put it on a face button or on a D-pad button, since you can just kind of throw it right as it is. So you know, I always see that as well, where you kind of have people just go ahead and do things like this pretty much, right? And then they'll kind of activate the Plentiful and go into Shroud. You can go into combo, do your fun stuff, and then you know, the difference, of course, is you got to be ready to switch to the other side of the hotbar to actually activate Communio, because you know, if you don't, then you don't really lose a lot of time if you like delay it. But of course, you want to throw it out as soon as you get the chance to, because it's just such a powerful attack for the Reaper. It's almost like a requirement as well. But yeah, this is my hotbar for the most part. You know, definitely like, you know, mess around with it if you want to. I feel like people like to technically take moves such as like Gallows, Gibbets, and Bloodstock, and then put it up here. So then instead of you know, you have like your you know, your AoE stuff here and your single targets here, so they kind of separate in that regard. But I personally like to just kind of keep everything separate hotbar wise with regards to wait, I'm getting confused with my own nonsense right now. There it goes. So I personally like to make sure that like when I need to use my AoEs, I double tap the trigger just to get to my AoEs, and then if I need to just, you know, naturally fight one target, I can just, all my single targets are down here pretty much, right? Except of the, you know, the exception of like Whirl of Death is the only real one. Now of course, other tools that you might want to utilize, such as you know, your mobility things, you know, with egress and ingress, obviously they're mobility tools, right? So if you, it's a little tricky to put them on like a directional, like a D-pad placement, and also on second hotbar, but I have those there with an idea of I have them there with the idea of trying to like minimize using them. Like if there's an AoE coming from the boss and it's pretty much like in their vicinity, rather than trying to you know, attack and then back away with the teleport, I actually just try to run out. Because again, you still have tools like Solso, right? And also if you try to use teleport, you also have Heartbreak that's like an instant cast, so you can run out, cast, and then go back in. That's actually more efficient than trying to like teleport out, because the amount of like animation frames that come from the teleport is actually quite a lot for you to do something. So you know, it's a lot slower if you teleport, shoot, and then go back in, even though I just use circle. And that's also an error that you can mess up with as well, so I try to avoid that as much as I can. So all the more reason to, you know, but again, it's always up to a preference for your sake as well. If you want to be able to have those at the ready, then you know, you can even put them on the first hotbar on the D-pad if you really wanted to do that. You can even switch them over here as well. I've seen this actually before too, just because again, being able to kind of move and activate, it comes in handy, right? But you gotta be careful with Reaper at least, because the direction you face, whether you do the front or the back, right, determines the direction you go in. So you know, if you're facing a certain direction and you press the ingress, then you obviously go straight. But if you face away and you go do egress, you go in the same direction, right? So you gotta make sure you just don't like confuse that. Also for fun tech, if you really want to try and have fun with it too, you can, I call it like reverse teching. So for example, when you jump, right, you kind of maintain momentum as you jump. So sometimes people usually try to jump out of AoEs in order to, you know, it's like a panic. So when you're trying to run away, you kind of jump out of the way kind of vibes. If you really want to, you know, for the sake of like simplicity, right, you can actually like jump and then teleport, and it actually carries you farther than if you just try to stand right here and teleport backwards, you know. So it's definitely safer if you can press the buttons fast enough. But in this position, it definitely works better that way. So you know, if I'm here and I run back, right, I would obviously be at this particular distance. But if I try to necessarily like get my hit and jump into it, obviously I've already covered a lot of ground just from running and jumping. But while I'm mid jump, if I teleport, you'll see it in a couple seconds. It'll actually cover a lot more ground from, you know, when I was by like this part of the area. If I try to, you know, just go ahead and it actually goes even farther. And that doesn't seem like a, you know, like a huge ordeal, but for some people it actually is like very important. So, you know, like I said, as long as you can kind of figure out what you're trying to work with, it does allow you to really cover a lot of ground if you need to use the teleport for any particular reason. But again, I personally try to avoid using it as much as I can, just because I feel like I want to try and be as close to the boss as frequent as I can, or even like a dungeon mob. So, you know, it's only like a useful movement tool if it needs to get to a place faster. That's kind of how I like to use it. So yeah, and again, like other moves like Solso, you know, if you want to also try to figure out how to maximize efficiency for that too, same purpose, right? Like rather than trying to teleport out and then do an attack and then go back in, you know, it's actually more efficient to just like run out and then use and then you go back in. I feel like that's also like really important. And you know, the complexity is that, you know, I can't show you my hands per se, but when I actually use Solso and I try to like hit and run out and I try and use it, you see I'm still moving while I'm throwing it, but that's because I'm literally like taking my right thumb and putting it on my left stick and then pressing the trigger and the D-pad with my left hand. That's very, you know, I'm very comfortable with doing that, so you kind of have to have the same sort of mentality for that as well, you know. So if you need to put Solso or Heartbeat on like a directional position, you know, whether you want to put it like here and like here, that's honestly fine, because at least, you know, you can still use Communio on a D-pad position and not necessarily like lose any kind of mobility for it, since it's a cast move. Shadow might be a little bit tough, but I feel like you don't need to use Shadow as often as you would use like your combos, so it's not really the worst case scenario. So this also works really well if you really want to try and, you know, find comfort in that scene as well. But I've always been used to just never really using you know, Solso and Harvest, so it's always like again, it's a very like if in case scenario. And lastly, one thing I wanted to showcase for sure is that if you look at my hotbar, you'll see I have Enshroud on the same position on both hotbars. This is actually deliberate. Like, I intentionally did this because if I'm somehow in like a little bit of a bind when it comes to trying to activate my Enshroud, because, you know, if I'm trying to go from one place to another and I'm pressing all these buttons and they're kind of going all over the place, you know, no matter what happens, if I'm like mashing my left trigger to activate Enshroud, I don't have to worry about trying to specifically land on the first hotbar to activate it. I can just, no matter what the case is, I can just activate it. That comes in handy significantly. Of course, like, it depends on the move, but you can do this with actually a lot of different keys. You know, I also would even take like Soul Slice and put it over here, where I have this old tank here. So no matter what, if I just press, you know, like the left trigger and press right, you know, I'll activate my Soul Slice. You know, you can definitely play a lot with a lot of different buttons for that. These are pretty much also all the buttons you need on your hotbar for the controller. There's nothing that's missing, and you have a little bit of space to you know, add a couple of things in. If you want to, for example, you can take out the teleports, and that'll give you 2 more buttons. So, you know, I can take those out, and then I can actually, you know, put like another arcane circle here and a gluttony here, and have the same situation, right, where like no matter what happens, if I press the triggers and I press up or down on the D-pad, I can just activate circle or gluttony. But of course, it's always going to depend on, you know, your comfort with how you want to set your hotbar as. So a lot of moves also, well, jobs even, their abilities have all shifted a bit so that there's actually more room for some jobs versus others. And like Reaper is an example where, you know, you can pretty much place several moves together in different positions, or, you know, in the same position, like you know, ideally, but you at least get to, no matter what happens, right, you can just press a certain button and then know that it's going to activate like no matter what, right? So even if I need to necessarily like do combos, you know, if I'm over here doing AoE combos, I can still activate the circle, and I can do this, you know, and then if I'm fighting like a mob of creatures, I can always, you know, everything actually up here still stays in AoE formation, right? And you actually get to benefit a lot from that just because you have the same buttons, you know, at the top. You don't have to go back and forth between two different hotbars. I feel like, you know, sometimes that becomes a little bit tricky, you know. So being able to multiplicatively put things in the same position, but just, you know, on different hotbars actually comes in handy. And you can do the same thing with macros as well. I feel like it really depends on, you know, what do you want to take out of it. But like I said, as long as you're able to at least create a hotbar that's comfortable for you, I recommend this. I feel like it's just really comfortable to be able to have moves in a position where, because, you know, because Reaper is a unique hybrid of being a caster and melee to some degree, right? With like Communio and with Harpe, you don't need to put cast moves on your faceplate buttons. You can put them on your directionals. But even that being said, though, right, you know, Reaper does have a lot of buttons to use that you'll need to be able to maximize your mobility for, and that always becomes very important for a lot of scenarios when you really want to just put yourself in a position where no matter what the case is, right, you just maximize mobility the whole time. And you don't have to really worry either about just, you know, where the boss is standing, as long as you can just put yourself in a position to really just let out all of your, you know, all your cooldowns and your moves. You know, again, I feel like if there's some moves that you feel like are not in a good position because of them being unidirectional, and you want to be able to make sure that you can activate them, you know, swapping around some moves that you might use every now and then or not at all will certainly come in handy. And if you feel like you're able to maximize, you know, your positional uptime, then, for example, you know, you don't necessarily have to put True North on your hotbar. There's actually several things you can take out because you may not rely on them too frequently, or maybe you will. You know, it's just a matter of finding that comfort. So hopefully this is a helpful way to kind of gain like a perspective on Reaper. And next time we'll be checking out Dragoon. I feel like Dragoon is a very similar vibe, so it'll be a great segue from learning how to set your hotbar on controller as Reaper, and so with Dragoon we'll definitely kind of fall on the same path. It's a little bit trickier with Dragoon, but it's kind of more or less the same. So thank you for tuning in. Hopefully you found this helpful, and if you have any questions, certainly let me know. Happy to answer anything, and have a good one.